This oral history of museum computing is provided by Andrea Ledesma and was recorded on the 2nd of April, 2021 by Paul Marty and Kathy Jones.
Okay, so I'm Andrea Ledesma. I have been working with museum technology since 2010, 2011 now, which kind of feels weird to say. In previous conversations talking about how I got into this space, I kind of describe it as a straight shot into nerddom. Uh, in the third grade, I remember convincing my entire class not to go see Spy Kids together, but that we all had to go to the Tech Museum in downtown San Jose because that was the spot to be, and I won, and it was a great field trip. That said, I studied history at Virginia Tech, and there, as I think many history majors or folks who study the humanities are like, well, what do I do with this work? And sort of finding myself realizing that like museums are a space that people who aren't just curators and aren't just people who have a doctorate can work in, and that like the discipline is very like diverse, I think, which is sort of the intent of this project, right? So my first year of college, I was figuring out like, well, what does that mean then to work in a museum? Like, do I want to do education, which I think was appealing to a point because I at that point kind of wanted to be a teacher, reminding myself of like, oh, so many of my teachers had inspired me to get into this field. Do I want to be a curator? What does that mean? Curator with a capital C was really scary to me, but it was really cool at the same time. So I ended up getting an internship with the National Archives in DC, and I was placed with essentially their social media and education team. And looking back on it, it was a really wild project because I knew I wanted to work with visitors. I wanted to work with like the internet and technology. I said as much in my interview because they were like also hiring for those internships. And at the time, the National Archives had a traveling Civil War exhibition. It was the sesquicentennial. I still don't know how to or spell that, but I can pronounce that. And at the end of that exhibition, there was like a podium where you could tweet at the exhibition something that you wanted to know more about or something that you learned, and then that would respond. And lo and behold, that Twitter account responding was me, the intern, watching the Twitter feed, and was sort of sitting there like a mechanical Turk of like, oh, this fun fact about this particular battle. Yes, I have a spreadsheet of responses and I will go in and respond for you. And so it was a little bit of that. It was, of course, monitoring responses and sort of like I guess what I would now kind of call sentiment analysis of like, oh, this is very clear that a whole bus full of middle schoolers just passed through the exhibition and they saw something that they could type on and they sent whatever, I was here, high school, whatever. And then like questions that people were asking and how often they'd be asked and like new questions that people had. So that was one piece of it. We also kept up like a wiki. I don't really know where that lives now. Kind of, yeah, Catherine. But yeah, we kept up a wiki that we would just sort of update with information as the sesquicentennial moved forward. And then the other piece of that internship, Tumblr was still a really big thing then. This was before Yahoo bought it out. And the exhibition was on food history. And we were pulling pieces from the National Archives online collections of like photos and basically just scheduling and generating posts for like National Ice Cream Day, or a lot of apple pie around the 4th of July. I do remember that like we got like the interns tour of the exhibition so that we could know what to send out on Tumblr. And they were talking to us about the smell in the exhibition because it smelled like chocolate chip cookies, and how for a little while the exhibition developers were like, well, should it smell like chocolate chip cookies or should it smell like apple pie? And chocolate chip cookies won out. So that was a really great summer. And I think as you do as an intern in DC during the summer, like we went to all the exhibitions and all the different museums and like talked to other folks. It was a really fun, and like that was kind of when like, oh no, I do actually like working with museum technology because I love the internet, I love museums, I love working with people. And it was just this perfect amalgamation of all that. So then after the National Archives, then I actually spent some time at my university's library and archives, helping them catalog and digitize cookbooks. When not in a museum, I love cooking, so that was the perfect thing for me. Realized working with special collections was not my groove, though I did love actually like flagging things like, hey, this would do really great online, or like put this in an exhibition. So that sort of like worked that way out of my system. So like maybe not libraries for myself, but after that, I actually then interned for and then eventually contracted with the museum, which unfortunately is no longer a thing, the museum in DC. I worked in their broadcasting department. The director then was Paul Sparrow, and it was described to me as like, if it goes on a screen, it goes through that department, which was really interesting to think about. Sort of then figuring out like, okay, well, what does technology mean to a museum at that point, right? I had mostly social media experience, but at the museum, the way it was structured, or at least the way I saw it as an intern from its structural perspective, that particular department was working with a lot of like the media and movie pieces that went through the exhibition, as well as a lot of the interactives. I remember one of my coworkers in that space had a big touch table in his cube, and he would always just sort of like tinker with it. It was really interesting too, because so many of the staff, at least in the broadcasting department, came from news media. So one, not hearing or not seeing anyone in the office, just hearing them coming around the corner of like, oh, you've definitely been on the news. Like you just have a voice for the news or radio. But they definitely took a different approach to it in terms of like thinking about how to sort of pre-produce and produce this sort of media. They drew a lot from their broadcasting background. The museum itself dealt with the news, the First Amendment, and news media. So sometimes they had like first person accounts of it, and were able to sort of pull on those experiences to create what that department did for the museum. So I spent a lot of my time like cutting my teeth, one could say, in museum technology with the museum. And then unfortunately that is no longer a thing. So I'm not quite sure where all of that media lives. I think it might still be with the First Amendment Foundation. But after interning and then eventually contracting with the museum, I then went on to like be a historian for a historical consulting agency for a little while, before eventually going back to grad school at Brown. And there I studied public humanities as the degree, and I sort of fashioned it along with some other folks in the university's like digital public humanities, where we really just thought about like, well, what ways might technology innovate how it is we sort of study history and culture and connect with each other and build and augment community. And then after Brown, or with Brown, then I worked with some folks at the Tenement Museum and the Digital Public Library of America, sort of doing the same sort of exploratory work and thinking about, again, content creation and product development in a museum space. And now, lo and behold, since 2017, I have been working at the Field Museum, first as a digital content coordinator, and now I'm a digital product specialist. So I work with their web and digital engagement team to build and manage web products. Things that fall into our wheelhouse for the museum include the website, fieldmuseum.org, which I'm the product manager for, as well as our blog and our social channels, which Twitter is one of our most popular ones. Sue the T-Rex has their own Twitter account, Instagram, Facebook, all of that. And as 2020 taught us, the definition of digital products that are relevant to a museum are very slippery. So other things that have fallen into my plate are the Message Maximo chatbot, digital wayfinding, and really, who knows? It's only just the start of Q2 in 2021. So we'll see what she has in store.
A quick question. If I tweet at Sue the T-Rex, who answers back?
Sue the T-Rex, of course.
Andrea, I assigned some news articles about the dinosaur to my museums and technology class this week, and some of the students had actually had the experience and were trying to have responses come back in Spanish. And there was one that said, I may be from Argentina, but I can't reply to you in Spanish yet. So I thought that was really great preparation for the future.
Yeah, and I can get into this now or in a bit, but that was actually something that my team and I were really trying to figure out with this particular product. Maximo as a dinosaur, so Maximo at the Field Museum is a touchable cast of the largest dinosaur ever discovered, right? And the persona that the Field Museum has built up for this particular dinosaur highlights the fossil's Argentinian roots. So we're like, oh, if we made a note that his name is Maximo, should he not also respond in Spanish? But I think it was as much a question of like resource allocation, right? Like developing a conversational chatbot in English is and was like a wild project that I'm so glad that we got to do. But doing that then in Spanish is also very different, right? Because it's not just translating those responses, but it's a lot of thinking about like, well, how would one ask this question in Spanish? What are the topics going to be mapped the same? What interest might a Spanish speaking audience or community bring to this particular product? And faced with like limited resources and acknowledging the limits of our own expertise, we decided to lead first with English, evaluate the performance of that of the English predominant product, and then think about how then we could build out in Spanish, right? I think we have contingency plans from like B to Z for how that could work based on how resources might come. But yeah, Catherine, that's exactly kind of it. Like we don't really want to say like error 404, response not found, but like thinking about like, okay, we kind of have to keep up the show and be kind about it, right?
So where did the idea for that chatbot come from?
Kind of out of like multiple minds on our team. I think very tactically, as many things are. There was a very generous gift that came to the museum that entrusted us to promote this particular new specimen fossil, right? And knowing that we wanted to do something digital with it, the ask fell down to our team. I know we just talked about Sue the T-Rex, but there were really early conversations where it's like, well, you know, if the brief is here's a pot of money to really activate this dinosaur, let's put him on Twitter. People love a dinosaur on Twitter. And we're also like, yeah, but you know, that's a path that's well worn. Sue is such a big personality. Lightning only strikes how many times, right? So then we started thinking like, well, how else might someone want to interact with a dinosaur? I think the chatbot came up pretty early, just as like, what if we did this? I think this was right around the time, right, that SF MoMA was in the news a lot with its Send Me SF MoMA app. Chatbots, especially at that point, were like, ooh, AI, chatbots, XR, like what might these present to a museum? And just thinking about like, what haven't we done yet and what can we experiment with? And I'm lucky that like our team also takes an approach where it's like, it's okay if we fail. Honestly, like if we don't fail, we're doing something wrong. We're not taking enough risks, right? So between the gift, others on my team, specifically like Brad Dunn, Catherine Urich, and Caitlin Carney, and myself, like, okay, chatbot, how could this work? So from there, we then went to our audience insights and research team, basically with the question that like, hey, we kind of want to do a chat bot. We don't know if audiences are into it. How can we figure this out, right? Like, can you help us survey some folks about how they might want to learn about Maximo or interact with Maximo if presented the opportunity? So like in this particular survey, we did ask about things too, like at that time we had the Brain Scoop YouTube channel. It's pretty active. So we asked like, do you want to see videos about Maximo? Would you want to see Maximo on Instagram? And we put it there as like Facebook Messenger, which I think was a mistake in some ways because you kind of lead the audience to think about a particular platform, and especially one as like fraught as Facebook. You hear Facebook and a lot of it's like, oh, I've deleted my account. Why would I do that? Or like, oh, Messenger. I like talking to people, but I don't always use Facebook Messenger, right? So the chatbot in that framework actually ranked pretty low. But because we recognized the sort of risks in that initial survey, we kind of just went like, we'll go for it. We're just going to try it. Like chatbot, we haven't done yet. It would be really interesting for our team to do. We have the resources. We have this persona that we can build out. So we sort of took it and ran, right? So much of the work of that chatbot went into understanding like, okay, if this might not be people's first choice, what do they want to know so that we can at least build a product in a framework that might not be familiar or even exciting to some folks, but gives them a story or information that they do find meaningful, that they do find useful. We had a really awesome intern at the time, Sarah Anderson, and one of her final projects was to help us think about questions that people might want to ask the dinosaur. So she just like spent a day in Stanley Field Hall, the Field Museum's like large open space, and just like watched folks and just sort of looked at Maximo. And one of the things that she like pulled off, she's like, where are his feet? Like the cast doesn't really have what I would call paws. Please don't tell a paleontologist that, but like they were missing. And then like Caitlin Carney on our team was like, well, people always ask about the bathroom. So Maximo, because he's so big, obviously he's going to know where the bathrooms are. He sees everything from up there. So it's like, okay, but what if we give them fun dino facts along with like some customer service tips and let's let it run, right? And we all came to the agreement that especially with something as open-ended as like a chat bot, so much of like selling this particular product to audiences also meant managing their expectations, right? That, you know, you can talk to Maximo about where he's from or how he's liking Chicago, but you might not be able to ask him everything, right? Like you can't ask him like, do you like what I'm wearing? But there are like little Easter eggs in there. Like, Maximo, if you were to wear a turtleneck, or if it's winter, would you wear a turtleneck or would you wear a scarf, right? So much of the work again was like essentially doing a map of all the content, and thinking about like, what topics would he respond to? How would he respond to these things? How would people ask these sorts of questions, and how are they connected to each other? Like, we worked with incredible agency Purple Rock Scissors, who helped us a lot with that initial content mapping and content strategy. And then we then brought in our savvy with the visitor experience and Maximo as a persona, and then of course our subject matters from science and collections, right? So that when someone asks where are Maximo's feet, it gives an answer that is delightful and scientifically sound. And so we had our like initial set of topics, and then from there we just kept on testing it, both with visitors in Stanley Field Hall, our own staff, because of course, the more questions you ask a chatbot, the smarter it'll be, which was especially important because Maximo is like a conversational chatbot versus, I guess, a customer service one, which initially into the product, we were looking at out of the box platforms for this that mainly worked off a call and response of like, someone says tickets, it'll give you the ticket link, and you sort of upload all of those potential like FAQs essentially in there. But ours is like, well, how might a conversation meander? We want to give it a little bit more freedom to learn and to grow over time. So we ended up using Dialogflow, which I think is now owned by Google, and then doing a lot of that, again, content mapping on our end before it went live. But when we were training it with visitors and staff, we would go in and say like, okay, Andrea asked, what did you have for dinner? But Paul asked, what did you eat? Both of those things ask about food, and both are valid questions. So we want to make sure that it goes there. One of my favorite memories from testing it, because it was always kind of like, of course, as you work with visitors, and especially if you're helping them test, or they're helping you test something, and or you're surveying them, you want to make sure they know what they're getting into. Like, hi, do you have a moment today? And I remember asking a kid, hi, would you like to talk to Maximo? And he just started yelling at him. And I'm like, wait, no, like, yes, you can, but maybe not that way. I love the enthusiasm. So like, we found that actually, like, when presented with just like a weird opportunity like that, bit, and they're like, oh yeah, like, sure, what would I ask it? And then the other surprising thing is that the range of topics people often ask Maximo were not as wide as we anticipated. Everyone wants to know what he eats. Everyone kind of wants to know, like, where did you live? How long ago did you live? We have like Easter eggs in there again of like the turtlenecks versus scarves and the Jurassic Park that so often people didn't hit. And then once we finally saw like, oh, they hit it, like we were so happy because we that's where we thought people would find like meaning of just like, oh, these odd things that a dinosaur would respond to. But people just like the novelty of it. And that's kind of also what we accepted about this product. I often find that maybe not as much now, that even with digital products, there's sort of emphasis on like retention and like permanence, and like it has to be this like long and significant and heavy, meaningful experience, which is very valid. And I can think of a number of digital experiences that have that resonant impact on me. But there is also something to be said of this, like, yep, that was delightful. It was like a little snack of an interaction, and it's kind of effervescent like that. And is it as meaningful? I would say yes, and it's just delivered in a very different way. And that's also what we kind of recognize too about the platform, which is why you could both text Maximo or message him from our website, that like you meet people where they are and you recognize people's like habits with media elsewhere, and we try to bring that into our space to create something just as engaging, but perhaps with a different storyline, right? So yeah, when we launched Maximo, people loved him. Like, we were like really glad to see the uptake. I think there were a number of people, especially early into the launch, who like saved Maximo into their contacts, and we were finding people were coming back. So with our particular platform, we can see conversations that people have, like who sends what. There's no personal identifying information, so I can't say like, oh, Paul, this is your conversation. But we would see people are like, hey, Maximo, I'm back, do you remember me? And we're like, hey, Maximo, I'm up late and I'm like kind of bored, what's up? And I was like, oh, that's really cute, because he's always there. And we really played that up too with the messaging, like Maximo is the friend who will always text you back. Like, he might not have an answer for everything, but he loves to talk and things like that. And one of the things that did surprise us, that we were kind of realized, like, wow, how did we miss that? Was so many people were asking Maximo to tell them a joke. And for all the jokes that we like tried to hide in there on the sly, we're like, wow, we actually didn't add a literal joke in there. So we finally got that up and running. And we heard it from our staff in like a soft launch. It was like, I think Maximo should tell a joke. And then we saw people hitting it like an error message. We're like, oh, we'll get that in there. But Maximo is like kind of on autopilot right now. The beauty of it, like, because it's been trained to a particular point and it's there. And again, because as currently framed for audiences, the topics they're hitting are like quite narrow. It is a product that we can kind of set and forget. We do hope to return to hit it eventually, but again, as many of us in the field know, that like how we prioritize and how we resource projects aren't always in our control. But it's been a delightful project. We still go in and see it. And actually, should say, with 2020, when the museum closed in March, so we saw sort of an interesting curve to usage. The first year it was live in 2019, we saw that the use of the chatbot often correlated with visitation in the museum. The more people were in the space, the more conversations we would see, which kind of made sense. We had signage there. It made for a really easy interaction if you were either like waiting in Stanley Field Hall, looking at other objects besides Maximo, or just like, hanging around, right? We had also like installed new furniture in that space so people could lounge. And we were seeing online pickup, but usually tied to like when we would actually tweet about the product, or if it went viral. Like, there was one instance where a prominent author had featured Maximo in like a Twitter thread. So we saw that uptake. And of course, when the Sue Twitter account picked it up, we were okay. But then when we closed in 2020, we did see a little bit of a dip. Of course, I think everyone saw many dips in March 2020 when stores closed. Of course, our website got a lot of traffic, as did a lot of our virtual offerings. And once we started promoting Maximo as a way to stay connected with the museum, we then figured, like, okay, like, we saw usage pick up again. Some edits we, of course, pushed made sense, because at that point you could ask Maximo how to buy tickets, if he was open, when they would see him next. We didn't do a full overhaul. I think our team is like less than 10 people for all of those products. So I think we had a lot of like wish lists, but we just eventually did not get to it, which is a little unfortunate. But again, as built, the product proved useful for folks even through closure. But even now, it's early April 2021, and we're seeing usage numbers pick up again.
Well, I just jumped online to ask Maximo to tell me a joke because I was curious to see what it would say. It's actually really great because it actually came back and said, would you like to hear a knock knock joke? So I said, no, I don't want to hear a knock knock joke. And it said, okay, which dinosaur slept all day? I'm like, which dinosaur? And the answer is the dino snore.
There we go. Yes, our team loves a dino pun. So.
But I was just so delighted to go and see. Not to derail the story, because I wanted just to keep going and talking about all of this. But you mentioned about the inspiration of Send Me SF MoMA. And we talked, I guess, about a month ago with Marla Masunis, and she talked a lot about the development of that.
Yeah.
And one of the things that she shared was that they learned so much about their collections and how other people viewed their collections from what people asked them through that app. So I was with, you've already given us, I think, some examples of this, but it just made me wonder, I mean, what have you learned about how visitors view the field through what they ask through this interface?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I So you talked initially at the start of this about how this project would put a human face to museum technology. And not to say that Maximo is human, but I did find that people really responded to a very human-esque voice, or like stories and responses from the Field Museum with this product. Like, I think, so we mentioned the Sue Twitter account a number of times in the conversation, which I think is one of the many sort of allures of that account, right? Is that it brings a very familiar, if not very like jovial, sarcastic tone to something that is very, very dead, right? And there's just something very joyful about that. I think museums spend so much time talking about like how we are active community spaces that bring people together, and that is true in many ways, but also the Field Museum is filled with literal dead things that we are meant to sort of draw contemporary meaning from, which it is possible. The work of our exhibitions and research and collections department, all incredible, and of course our education team. But there's something to be said that like this fossil cast in front of you is actually responding to the questions that you have and hearing it straight from them. It's just like you kind of you buy into the allure of it, and it's just delightful. I think people resonated with that. I think we learned a lot too about just like basic visitor services questions. And I think so many of us, again, I made the joke about like, where are the bathrooms? We're like, oh yeah, like we should also throw in one about coat check in there and our hours and tickets, because especially like working in a museum, these are just things that you know about your space, and you have to remember that like you are not your audience, and like, you know, those sorts of system or those sorts of logistics to navigate aren't always easy. So you always want to make it easy for people to come into your space. Beyond that, though, I think we just learned a lot about how it is we converse with visitors and people online in general. Again, our assumptions of what everything people might want to know versus what they actually asked was a good reminder to me of like, sometimes you don't need to overthink it and you don't need to overcomplicate it. And sometimes the simplest answer is the most impactful one. I would gladly tell Maximo that. We'll see how the topics grow out, but like, yeah, knowing something as simple as like, what would you want to eat, was just like very reassuring to me. It's like, yeah, it doesn't always have to be as finessed or engineered as I think it to be initially.
I was also really excited to hear the examples you were giving about the sort of the user experience research that went into to creating this chatbot, and this is a theme that's come up in a lot of these histories that we've captured as well. And I was hearing you tell the story, I feel like there's like a sweep here between the work you were doing as an intern in DC to the work you're doing now. And I don't know if you know, over a 10 or 11 year period, if it seems that way to you, but over that time period, how have you seen this, you know, this focus on the user experience change in museum technology?
I think it has been, so the focus on the user experience, I think, has been consistent in the work that I've done and the positions that I've held. And I very much appreciate that. If anything, I think how we think about who the user is and what that experience can or needs to be has changed over time. Many thanks to actually MCN helping me sort of figure that out, because I wouldn't say, you talked to me in 2010, I wouldn't necessarily talk about what I was doing as the user experience. I would actually be very quick to say that like, oh, I'm basically like putting information out there. Like I'm a loudspeaker. Like the user is the person I respond to any particular way. But then like, talk to me now. And it's of course like, once you got to start with, well, what do they want to know? And how are they going to want to know that? right? So I guess it's that shift from like talking to your audience to talking with and actually listening to them, because there's one thing to get their feedback and there's another thing to like hear it, internalize it, amplify it, and then actually do something with it, right? And I think that latter piece is really what's been exciting, especially now. But yeah, I think just even thinking about like how fraught a term a user might be, because even if you think about user, it's very mechanical, it's very clinical. Like, is it your audience, is it your visitor, is it your community? I like those like semantic debates. I think there's tenets to both of the ways of like how we understand a visitor versus a user. And even in my own work, I try to be very intentional with that, because I think if you were to come into the museum and interact with Message Maximo, it would be different than if, you know, you're off in California, you're an avid like follower of the museum social stuff, and then you ask questions from there. Because there's something to be said, again, with a specific product of like looking at Maximo and asking questions, and then trying to imagine this, the experience of like standing below the largest dinosaurs ever discovered and figuring out, okay, what do I want to know about this, right?
Yeah, no, I agree on the issue of vocabulary as well, right? The use of the term user. You know, I often try to say human-centered design, but then we run into a problem where people use the term UX, so we've got the U still in there, and so it's hard to balance this. You know, at the very least, I will say that at least in academia, we've slowly shifted away from human subjects research to human participants research, which is an important trend.
Right. And even that, like, there's participant, there's co-collaborator, and I think within the last 2 years you hear co-conspirator, which I particularly love just because I like being sneaky. But again, I understand like how you could pull upon each depending on what it is you're trying to achieve together, right? Because sometimes like, oh yeah, like I don't need to be a co-conspirator, but like here are my notes and here, like I trust you to take them and run, right? Versus, all right, let's drop a spreadsheet together, let's figure this out.
That, that's really great. What I was going to ask. I was intrigued by the many internships that you've done in all these different places, and I was trying to figure out a question about how you build upon those experiences. Like, what do you take from the work that you did at DPLA? How does that inform what you're doing at the field? That sort of thing.
Yeah. So the DPLA, the Digital Public Library of America, for me was a really great experience in how you might activate your collections. I worked with like educators and public engagement specialists there, and I understand that the DPLA has since reorganized since I was there in 2017. So I can't say to their like full structure now, but like the DPLA is an aggregator, right? And like bringing so many collections together. And a conversation you often hear in like the space of the digital collections is like, just because you put it online does not make it meaningful, does not make it intuitive. So much of our work then was like, okay, what's a way that we can bring collections pieces from disparate institutions together to tell a cohesive and meaningful story. So I worked on a digital exhibition for them that looked at American imperialism, right? Which is like thinking about a lot of that now. So like looking through photos and records of spaces that tell the story of America as a colonial power and the consequences that wrought on the people and the spaces that they were in, right? Versus like later on, like they redesigned their site that year as well. So thinking about just very easily, like how do you search over so many things, right? Like if you wanted to find a cat, any sort of artifact related to a cat, how might you go about that? Is it sort of making the tools easier for open search? Is it suggesting a pathway? Is it creating a tag structure that allows these pieces to be brought together? It was so much of that. Like I had come into the project, into the redesign project a little later on into the phase, so I can't speak to this like any sort of schema, but just thinking about like how a website presents itself to lead a user to a particular experience, but also open itself up to what the user might teach like the folks behind the website. Like I look upon the DPLA as like really informing that approach to my work now.
You know, it's funny listening to you talk about sort of those lessons learned there. It reminds me of the conversation we had with Seb Chan, and he was talking about how in so many institutions, they put a focus on the product, and they forget that the most important thing are the lessons that we learn from the process of building it, because those are the lessons that you can take with you to the next thing you do.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's, I'm a little bit of a process fiend. I very much appreciate Seb for bringing that up, because I do think that, again, like if your project sunsets, it's not necessarily indicative of failure. It's like what you learn from it, right? And oftentimes, like especially like the website, like that is continuously improving. That's never going to be done. So often what I find from our redesign piece, so the field museum redesigned its website in 2018, is like, okay, what are the bridges that we built to get there, and how can we cross them over and over and over again to either continue improving the website, build out a new product like Message Maximo, reposition some work with 2020 once everyone was brought online. Like that to me is really like actually where I find a lot of value of my own work. When I was studying public humanities at Brown, so much of our conversations focused on community engagement, either as like co-collaboration or like how to like properly serve and amplify a community without like being exploitive or extractive, and like learning from those voices, right? And I think like museum technology does a really good job of that, looking at like your visitors and your online audiences. And what's interesting to see now and really meaningful to me is that lens now turning inwards more acutely, of like, okay, well, who's your audience, or who will support you within an institution to make these digital products happen, who will support you in that process that you've established to build these things, but also like who can help you improve it, because like maybe this is really complicated. What's a more direct line we can get from like point A to B? With Message Maximo especially, I can think of so many staff in like science and education and our audience insights and research, like that product would not be possible had it not been for them. Do they look at themselves as museum technologists as you and I might? I don't think so, but they are doing that work, and I think kind of speaks to the slippery scope of what it means to do technology in museums now.
Well, and as you say, it speaks to the getting the buy-in from leadership, right? Having leadership that is willing to support. It sounds like you're lucky you've got that at the field, right?
Right. Right. I think so, especially with the field museum and my team. So my supervisor, Brad Dunn, who was like also working on Message Maximo, we have that sort of same ethos of like, let's just try it. Like there's a way to do it big time and there's a way to do it small. And it's okay to like start small and like test and learn. And that sort of approach I really appreciate with so much of what we do. And of course you can't get to the big shiny product until you just start with like maybe just the inkling of a question of like, how will folks like this? Or like, is this useful, or is this interesting?
Well, and that's one of the nice things about looking at a historical sweep like this, is that no matter how worried we might be at any one particular point right here now in the present, if you look back over the past 30, 40 years, we've really made tremendous strides. We've really come a long way,
Right.
just in terms of the way we think about technology in museums.
Exactly.
We're coming up to the top of the hour. We've heard some fantastic stories from you. Kathy, did you have any questions? Andrea, was there some other points you wanted to make?
I think in terms of Message Maximo, you have the full story. I can send you some like supplemental stuff if that's helpful, but I know like with an oral history, it's all in this recording. I think just to put a finer point on it, and again, echo what Seb Chan said about the value of process and documentation. Like, I can't really stress that enough, at least for my own practice of this, that like you don't know what you know until you try it, and you can't do something new unless you know where you've been before. So being able to draw on not only like, okay, past person who had worked on digital products, like how did you approach this? What did you learn? Where did you fail? Like that to me is so important. Like you have to be honest in your own record keeping too, but also just speaking to the testament of like the museum technology community. Like we talked to the folks too at SF MoMA about send me SF MoMA when we were doing this. Like how did you all define success? Like what should we watch out for? And all sort of learning that like we're all trying something new together. So if you put something out there, you might have to sunset it, but there's a ready community of professionals in this field who are ready to catch you and be like, tell us what you learned. Like the fact that you tried that is cool. Like, let's figure this out. And I know that's also been continued to an MCN of like fail hard and fail fast. I think was it like Ignite Talk one year that was incredible. Just like, yeah, like there's no shame in trying.
No, I love the point that you're making about underscoring the importance of documentation, of record keeping, of sharing the lessons learned, and needing to have a professional community with whom you can share that. Do you have an internal process at the field, like, I don't know, a blog or something where you keep all of this?
Yeah, we don't. So while as much as I personally appreciate folks who like keep those like public facing like notebooks of work, like one of the ready examples right now is Cooper Hewitt or their Interaction Lab, or even with the pen, right? They had that blog that I had turned to in grad school and think about now. The unfortunate fact is that we're not quite there yet with the field. But that said, internally, we do just have, I think as many do, like a very like wealthy Google Drive network of folders and processes. Of course, like every year or so we have to look back. It's like, okay, well, this is the archive copy, this is the copy we used to share. Like that's just some like record keeping maintenance there that I think comes with every job, but always trying to think about like, okay, where's the project brief that tells us what this thing is, what were our guiding goals, and who did we work with. I think that is a practice that we've really been able to finesse, especially with 2020, because of how quickly we were intaking work and how quickly easy it was to get lost in just doing the thing, that even the practice of creating a brief or a scope and schedule like allowed us the moment to just pause and be like, why are we doing this and what are we trying to achieve by when? Like, that is such an important question to ask yourself with anything that you do in this space. So we have that. Like, I am not a stickler for like, why is your document not 12-point font? It's like, just show me where the document is. Like, as long as we all have an agreement of what it needs to achieve, I'm happy.